Hi Internet! Welcome to the Gredtroyan YouTube channel. To celebrate the release of Final Fantasy XVI, I decided to do 16 videos ranking different aspects of the series from least best to best. This video will be ranking the games based on how good I think the story is for each game. To me, story is the most important part of a Final Fantasy game, and it tends to be the part I most heavily weigh when drafting my opinions on the games. Or at least that's what I'd like to think. There's obviously some crossover discussion between ranking other categories like cast and villains, but I'll try to avoid redundancy when I can. This list is a hybrid between personal preference and my attempt to view the writing from an objective quality standpoint. My list is sure to be different than yours, and that's okay. I want to see your ranking in the comments below, and while you're there, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to the channel. Oh, and one last note. I do plan on speaking on broad terms in order to avoid spoilers, but if you don't know the plot of a particular game and want to go in completely blind, maybe skip that section just to be safe. Personally, I don't mind spoilers, but I know a lot of folks do, so for your sake, I'll try not to give away anything too major, but I need to actually be able to talk about the plots of these games to discuss my ranking justification. And, as a final reminder, this is a ranking of the main series base games only, not MMO expansions or sequels, with Tactics being the lone exception. Cool? Cool. Alright, let's get on to the ranking. Number 16, Final Fantasy I. Coming in at the bottom of the list is the original Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy I is pretty bare bones in terms of story. The premise is as basic as they come in the series. The world is slowly succumbing to darkness as the elements weaken. 4 warriors of light appear from out of nowhere and go on a quest to save the world and restore the light. That's basically it. There's not much here, so I don't have too much to say about it. While there are some memorable characters like Garland and Matoya, and the twist regarding the final boss is pretty fun, for the most part, the story of Final Fantasy I feels watered down and simplified compared to the rest of the series. There are lots of thematic elements and concepts from this game that would be used in later installments, but the thing is, Final Fantasy I does those ideas and concepts worse than pretty much every single follow-up in the series. The ideas are good, but they ended up being reused to far greater effect in future entries. Final Fantasy I's story definitely wins points for originating those grand concepts, but when judged against the other entries in the series, it's an easy last place for me. Number 15, Final Fantasy XI. As mentioned in my video introducing the series, for the MMOs, I'm judging them only on the base game. In the case of Final Fantasy XI's story, that means the nation missions up to rank 5, as that was where Final Fantasy XI's original final boss, the Shadow Lord, was defeated. So that story ends up taking the number 15 spot in the ranking. Final Fantasy XI's base story is about a player-created adventurer who emigrates to one of 3 nations, Bastok, Windurst, or Sandoria, and begins undertaking missions to improve their standing in their new nation. Adventurers are extremely common in this world and are basically mercenaries for hire doing an array of odd jobs from delivering letters to defeating fearsome monsters. As the adventurer continues to rise in rank in their nation, they uncover a plot to revive the villainous Shadow Lord, who terrorized the land in a brutal war 30 years prior. The adventurer does their best to stop the Shadow Lord from rising and terrorizing the land with darkness once again. Like Final Fantasy I, the plot is overall pretty basic, but the backstory of the Shadow Lord is actually really well done, with a surprising amount of character depth. For that reason, Final Fantasy XI easily ranks above Final Fantasy I's story, despite the rest of the base game not offering much in terms of compelling narrative. In terms of the individual nations, they do vary in story and quest quality, but they mostly converge around the Shadow Lord missions before diverging again afterwards. The Sandoria missions mostly revolve around political machinations between 2 rival princes, but it's a lot less interesting than it sounds. The Bastok missions mostly revolve around tensions between the nation's 2 primary races, Human and Galka, which is solid. The Windurst missions mostly revolve around secrets hidden inside ancient ruins and what those secrets mean for the citizens of the magical nation, and it's actually pretty damn good, and by far the best of the 3 nations in terms of story. But it's also by far the most difficult path to take for a new player, and the story tends to really get good after rank 5, which is after the base game ends. Your experience with the base story of 11 will vary depending on which nation you go with, but the quality is generally pretty close, and the plots do converge at a certain point, and that conversion point is the strongest part of the base game. So, base 11 has a better story than 1, but not a better story than any of the other games in the series. While some of 11's expansions are excellent, and easily stand alongside the best of the series in terms of story, those are being counted as sequels to make this a fair fight, and because of that, this is where OG Final Fantasy XI ends up on this list. Number 14, Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn. Okay, hold on Final Fantasy XIV fans, put down your pitchforks. Remember, this is a ranking of the base game's story only. Since the original version of 14 is unplayable these days, that means that A Realm Reborn is now the base game. While I have watched the cutscenes for 1.0, my ranking is not going to factor that in. Spoiler alert, 1.0 is boring. Based only on A Realm Reborn, Final Fantasy XIV ends up in the number 14 spot, which wasn't on purpose but is pretty fun now that I think about it. A Realm Reborn had the Herculean task of being both a sequel to the failed Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 and also a soft reboot so newcomers could appreciate it without experiencing the original game. It's impressive that the writers were able to pull it off, and I commend them for that. However, the story of A Realm Reborn didn't really grab me all that much compared to other entries in the series. Like Final Fantasy XI, the world of Final Fantasy XIV is full of adventurer mercenaries. 5 years ago, the Garlean Empire brought down the Blood Moon Dalmund from the heavens in an attempt to destroy an alliance of nations that dared stand against its power. And while they were ultimately stopped, there was great devastation across the land. Now that the world has begun its recovery, the Empire's threat continues to rise alongside the threat of beastmen summoning their primal gods. And it's up to one adventurer, who also happens to be the Warrior of Light, to save the day. Along the way, he teams up with a society of heroes known as the Scions of the Seventh Dawn, and together, they bring a new era of light to the land. Right off the bat, there's way more to chew on than the previous two base games on the list. However, I didn't really fall in love with any of the characters, and a lot of the narrative felt like a slog to get through. There's an entire arc about gathering ingredients from around the world to throw a party for yourself at the beach. The ridiculous filler ended up breaking my disbelief for the story pretty heavily, and for a series as ridiculous as Final Fantasy, that's kinda incredible, and in a way, I respect the game for that. However, it happens a lot more in this game than you'd think, and the fetch quest nature of the story made the plot feel really bloated. A Realm Reborn was a lot darker of a story than what I expected, which isn't a good or a bad thing, but rather just an observation. And while I like the overall story content of 11's expansions far more than anything I played in 14 up to this point, #HotTakeTroyan, I have to acknowledge that if we're doing a side-by-side comparison of 11's base story versus A Realm Reborn, 14 absolutely crushes 11 in that regard. Number 13, Final Fantasy XII. At this point in the ranking, we still haven't gotten to any of the stories in the Final Fantasy series I can say that I truly love. There are aspects of all these stories that I like quite a bit, but as a whole, there isn't anything that I would consider really excellent. 12's story, like the previous entries on this list, feels a bit bland compared to some of my favorites in the series. It's really a slow burn, full of false starts. The main reason the story of this game ranks above the previous entries on this list is because of the characters and their shining moments throughout the narrative. While I'm not huge on the cast of 12, it does have significantly better character beats than the previous entries, which all happen to be games with nameless character-created heroes. Go figure. The story revolves around Ashe, princess of the fallen kingdom of Dalmasca, as she tries to take back power from the grip of the Arcadian Empire. She's joined by a disgraced knight named Bosch, a pair of sky pirates known as Balthier and Fran, and two young Dalmascan youths named Vaan and Penelo. The game actually mostly treats Vaan as the POV main character, but the plot generally revolves more around Ashe. While it does have some fun and light-hearted adventurous moments in its plot, and it does mix in a lot of traditional Final Fantasy tropes and beats, the story ultimately tries to take on a more serious political tone. But the politics aren't interesting enough to justify this attempt, and in turn, a good chunk of the narrative just feels bland. The lead designer on the project, Yasume Matsuno, is well known for his incredibly political narratives, but he left the project midway through, and the half-hearted attempt to maintain some of his energy while mixing in beats of a more traditional Final Fantasy adventure come off as not satisfying the narrative desires of either, and the nuances of Matsuno's political takes are completely lost in the finished plot. We end up with a plot heavy on politics, but very uninteresting surface-level politics. This isn't Game of Thrones with a complex web of alliances. The politics are Empire bad, but the story acts like it's Game of Thrones in terms of nuance, and it really falls flat. A lot of people praise the prose of the translation, and yes, they do a very good job, but the core story just isn't very interesting to me. However, because of a few character highlights, like the arc between Vaughn and Bosch, it manages to reach the number 13 spot. Number 12, Final Fantasy V. Final Fantasy V is well known as one of the games in the series with a weaker story and stronger gameplay. This is a fairly accurate statement in my estimation. However, despite being a weaker story in the overall context of the series, I still found it to be stronger than the previous entries on the list. The story revolves around 4 heroes tasked by destiny to defend the 4 elemental crystals as the world slowly succumbs to darkness. Sound familiar? Unlike Final Fantasy I, the characters in this game have names, backstories, and, arguably, personalities. Bart is a free-spirited nomadic adventurer with nothing really going on in his life. Lena is a princess determined to save the world. Galuf is an aloof old man suffering from amnesia, and Ferris is a badass and extremely competent pirate captain. The story has a couple good set pieces, like a magical library where the books attack you, and a spooky ship graveyard. There are some fun supporting characters like Guido, a wisecracking magical turtle, Gilgamesh, a hilarious comic relief henchman, and Exdeath, a main villain who really feels like a comic relief henchman. There's also Flossie, a sheep from a one-sheep town and actual named NPC. And there's Moogles. The characters mostly have a Saturday morning cartoon feel to them, at least in comparison to other Final Fantasy characters, giving the story a generally lighter and breezier vibe than other entries in the series. Apparently this was done intentionally, as the original draft of this game's story was supposedly the darkest story the series had done up to that point, and drastic rewrites were done to make it more light and fun. While they succeed in making something light and fun, it also lacks depth, and the arcs of the characters end up being pretty minimal and bland. It works better than 12's story because of how fun it is, but it's still not really a great Final Fantasy story. Number 11, Final Fantasy III. Okay, now I know this is going to shock a lot of folks. Final Fantasy III ranking above Final Fantasy V? What? Most fans consider V to be a better executed version of III, and in the past, I would have largely agreed. In retrospect, however, I think that III had a better overall narrative than V. While it's pretty inarguable that V's gameplay is far superior to III's, the story is ultimately up to a little more debate. The story of Final Fantasy III is about 4 warriors of light who are tasked by magical crystals to save the world from darkness. In the original version of Final Fantasy III, the heroes are 4 children from the village of with no names or specific personalities, though they do have dialogue unlike the heroes from the first game. In the remake, the 4 heroes are given names, specified character designs, and personalities. Luneth is courageous and headstrong, Ark is shy and bookish, Refia is kind and caring, and Ingus is determined and steadfast. In both games, the 4 leads are orphans, but their backstories differ between the pixelated and 3D versions. Luneth and Ark are both from the village of while Refia is the adopted daughter of a blacksmith with no desire to go into the family business. And Ingus is a rural knight who initially accompanies the party more out of an obligation to his kingdom than any feelings of camaraderie towards the other heroes. The remake of 3 attempted to bridge the gap in story between the original release of the game and the stronger narratives the series would later become known for. 3 and 5 are 2 of the most similar games in the series, especially given that their main cast doesn't really offer much in terms of character arcs in their respective stories. So, why rank 3 above 5? Both games are largely a series of smaller set pieces in between gathering more power from the crystals to beat the big bad, and it's really hard to get into why I think 3 is slightly better without going into specific spoilers. I'll say that 3's vignettes offered stronger arcs for the supporting characters that the heroes meet along the way, and the way that all those vignettes tie together in the ending makes the narrative feel like a richer storytelling experience. The villains in 3 are also less comical, and I think more interesting in concept, so that helps with the story as well. Like 5, the story is lighter and has a lot of charm, but I think it ultimately succeeds at the goal of being a fun romp more than 5 does, but only by a hair. This is the slimmest of margins, and the 2 are really neck and neck. Overall, 3's story isn't necessarily great, but it has a lot of charm, and that charm allows it to barely escape the top 10 on this list. Number 10, Final Fantasy VIII. Final Fantasy VIII is a game about Squall Leonhart, a seed from Balam Garden. Balam Garden trains mercenaries, known as Seeds, who are privately hired to execute military missions across the globe. Squall and his team get hired by Renoa Hartley, a freedom fighter from the nation of Timber who seeks to free the nation from the fearsome Galbadian military, led by a mysterious sorceress. However, Squall and his companions have mysterious dreams where they inhabit the bodies and thoughts of a man named Laguna and his companions, and they must uncover the mystery of these dreams in order to save the world. Along the way, Squall learns to open his heart to find true friendship and even love. While this all sounds good on paper, Final Fantasy VIII's story is ultimately really dumb. Like, think of the cheesiest action movie you've ever watched, and mix it with the most melodramatic and over-the-top teen drama anime you've ever seen. It's that. It is an absolutely hilarious ride that is nigh impossible to take seriously, and it ends up being a constant series of jaw-dropping, unintentionally comedic moments. The characters are absurd and act like idiots. The world is absurd, with nonsensical politics. The plot twists are ridiculous, and it has arguably the dumbest plot twist in video game history. The story is so freaking dumb. I used to hate this game's story for that reason, but now I love it for the exact reasons I hated it. This game is freaking hilarious and I love it. If you can laugh at the absurdity of the story, you'll have a great time with it. There's a bit of bad news, however. Towards the end of Disc 3, the story gets legitimately good. Like, some of the best story moments in the entire series good, executed perfectly with powerful emotion. Unironically great stuff. The game becomes legitimately brilliant on the turn of a dime, and it's infuriating because the story was so stupid and fun, and then the game was somehow able to pull off something genuinely emotional and moving, but it didn't feel earned given the ridiculousness of what came before. Final Fantasy VIII, just where do you think you've earned the right to be this good all of a sudden? If you're taking VIII completely seriously as a story, it's pretty atrocious up until the end, where it suddenly becomes a top-tier Final Fantasy story. But if you find yourself in the right headspace, it's one of the most entertaining plots in the series. There are cringe moments, and there are emotionally powerful moments, but they're all memorable, which is more than I could say about a lot of the previous entries. I wouldn't say the whole story of Final Fantasy VIII is overall good, but I do think it's overall entertaining. Number 9. Final Fantasy XV. Final Fantasy XV is probably the hardest game for me to rank based on my criteria of judging the plots of these games based only upon the base game. So much of the game's story was told in tertiary media like the Kingslave movie, the Brotherhood anime, the Dawn of the Future novel, and the DLC chapters added to later releases of the game. Given that the DLC comes included with the game these days, and Brotherhood and Kingslave being free to watch on streaming services, and were released prior to the game, I'm considering these to be fair game when factoring in my impression to the story, but I'm gonna try not to weigh them too heavily. The story of Final Fantasy XV revolves around Prince Noctis Lucius Kylum of the Kingdom of Insomnia. He, along with his 3 retainers, Gladio, Ignis, and Prompto, are going out on a last hurrah road trip before Noctis is to meet his bride-to-be, an oracle named Lunafreya. The marriage is largely a political one, though Noctis and Lunafreya are old childhood friends. While on the road, Noctis' kingdom is invaded by the Niflheim Empire, and his entire life is thrown into chaos as he learns to grow up, take responsibility, and save the world. Final Fantasy XV is, like Final Fantasy XII, built from the ashes of a completely different story with a completely different tone than the finished product. The story of Final Fantasy XV falls short in a number of places, especially in regards to the main romance of the game, and it definitely feels incomplete in a number of ways, even including all of the supplemental materials. Despite all of this, the story does succeed in a number of ways, and unlike VIII, they're mostly on purpose. 15 has a great cast of characters, and you really feel the bond between the 4 leads. The bromance they establish over the course of the story is believable and endearing. 15 also has one of the best villains in the entire series. The main villain steals every scene with charisma up the wazoo and has a fascinating backstory that continually keeps you interested. Even people who don't like 15 acknowledge he's a great character and his story is very well done. The ending itself is powerful and moving, but like 8, it feels a little unearned. The whole game is a mixed bag with some great elements, but some of it feels really undercooked. While Final Fantasy XV may stumble in a number of ways, when it hits, it really hits, and thus ends up at the number 9 spot on my list. Number 8. Final Fantasy XIII. Final Fantasy XIII's story is very controversial amongst fans of the series, But then again, so are the stories of Final Fantasy VIII and XV, so it feels somewhat appropriate to have them all lumped together in this ranking. Of the three stories, I think that XIII ultimately executed the best story of the three more controversial games, though it isn't without flaws. The plot of Final Fantasy XIII can be a bit hard to summarize in brief text, but I'll do my best here. There are two nearby planets, Pulse and Cocoon, though Cocoon is arguably closer to a moon in terms of size and proximity to Pulse. Pulse is a wild and harsh land filled with dangerous monsters, while Cocoon is a technological marvel where humanity lives in comfort. There are creatures known as fal'Cie from both Pulse and Cocoon, which will often find humans and brand them as l'Cie, essentially slaves to the godlike fal'Cie. They're given a mission called a focus, and the l'Cie have two options: perform the mission and turn to crystal afterwards, or refuse and turn into a monster. Either way, it's a tragic fate. Our heroes end up being branded as Pulse l'Cie and have to find a way to defy their fates and save both worlds before it's too late. Final Fantasy XIII is very much like Final Fantasy VIII in that there are parts of it that are incredibly dumb and unintentionally hilarious. However, as silly as some parts of it can be, there's still a lot of stuff that's really great on an unironic level. The cast of XIII is really strong and one of the better casts in the main series. Their relationship web is incredibly well written. Each character has a different relationship and view of each party member, and the ways in which they intersect and weave through their interactions is continually interesting and engaging. The strong character dynamics are what help rank this game's story so high, along with a solid main plot to move things forward. There are flaws though. The main villain is very lackluster, and a lot of the lore can be a bit convoluted and confusing upon first glance. A lot of folks say you need to read the data logs to understand the story of the game, and that's not really true, as my wife was able to play XIII without viewing the data logs, and was able to understand the plot just fine, but the game does throw a lot of plot, lore, and terminology at you all at once while only drip-feeding explanations. Overall, another mixed bag, but more positive than negative in my opinion. While the main villain in Final Fantasy XIII is a bit lackluster, the world, lore, and character arcs help propel the story above the previous entries on the list. I think 15 and 8 might have higher highs, but in terms of telling a story from beginning to end, I think 13 ultimately does a better job at fleshing out character arcs and story than either of those entries. Number 7. Final Fantasy VI. Final Fantasy VI is considered by many to have the best story in the entire Final Fantasy series. For me, I think it's an above-average Final Fantasy story. Not the peak of the series, but not bottom of the barrel either. The main plot of Final Fantasy VI revolves around a group of rebels called the Returners fighting against the evil Gastalian Empire, who have been using magic-enhanced technology called Magitech to conquer the fantasy steampunk-inspired world the game takes place in. Through the capture and utilization of espers, magic beings from another realm, the Empire has become a near unstoppable force, and it's up to our ragtag gang of heroes to stop them. The game has the largest main cast in the main series, outside of the MMOs, with 14 main playable characters, not including temporary guest characters. Some of the characters are fantastic and have great arcs. Edgar, Locke, and Realm are particular favorites of mine. Some are kind of boring like Umaro and Strago, however the main villain, Kefka, is truly great. One of the best villains in all of media. Fan-freaking-tastic. No complaints with that guy, he's a captivating presence and definitely helps elevate the story. That said, the main protagonist is a bit bland to me, and it's to the story's detriment. Fans will argue that 6 has no main character, but truthfully, it really has 2 lead protagonists. One is the lead at the start of the game, a girl named Terra who can mysteriously use magic without the usage of Magitech, and the second lead character, Celis, is also a girl who can use magic without the usage of Magitech, who really steps into the role of protagonist at the point of the big plot twist. The personalities of the two are drastically different, but their roles in the story actually end up being somewhat similar in terms of the Empire viewing them as nothing more than powerful weapons to be utilized. The former main character is given more backstory and lore, while the latter is given more personality. In my opinion, the game would have had a far stronger narrative if the two were simply combined into one character, as the already bloated cast of the game could have used some trimming. Terra's character arc is one that I don't really find compelling to relate to. Terra has little understanding of human emotions and relationships, almost like a robot, and her arc basically boils down to learn how to interact with and care for other people. It's basically, how do I people? But as a person who is generally friendly and sociable, it never really resonated with me. VIII arguably did the same arc for its lead character, but I found him to be a more believable, if less likable, character. While the majority of VI's main cast have subplots and side stories, the quality of these tends to vary. That said, it does lean more towards the positive than the negative. However, the narrative has some significant flaws for me, in particular the events after the big twist. While that moment and the immediate aftermath is great, the story screeches to a halt at that point and loses a lot of momentum. This section of the game is often considered to be the best part of Final Fantasy VI, but for detractors and those bold enough to critique it, it can be a bit of a slog and an unwelcome change of pace. I fall somewhere in the middle of these two camps, but while most of the game's story I lean positive, I actually lean slightly negative on the game's latter half in terms of narrative. That's not to say I don't love Final Fantasy VI's story, but I do find it to be a tad overrated. There are some amazing set pieces in the story, like a large-scale battle with a small army of Mughals, and there's a hilarious talking octopus who keeps showing up that is probably my favorite character in the whole game. VI's story has a lot of stuff I absolutely love, but there's also a lot of stuff I'm not so hot on. It's one of the best video game stories ever written, but it's also from the same series that continually writes some of the best video game stories ever written. And for me, there are other stories in this great series that I like more. Number 6. Final Fantasy II. Final Fantasy II, like many games in the series, featured a group of underdogs battling against an evil empire bent on world domination. While we've seen this plot structure in games like XII and VI, I find that the best version of this general outline is its originator in the main series. Final Fantasy II's take on this plotline is incredibly dark and bleak for the series, and really captures the horrors of war better than any mainline entry. While the script may leave a little to be desired in terms of the personalities of the three main leads, Furion, Maria, and Guy, the supporting cast of temporary party members like Minwu, Ricard, Joseph, and Layla is incredibly endearing and actually really well written, making the many tragedies you experience over the course of the story all the more heartbreaking. The plot of Final Fantasy II has a lot of momentum and the whole experience is very tight, moving from plot beat to plot beat without extraneous fat, making the dire nature of the struggle feel visceral throughout. The villain, Emperor Mateus, is one of the best in the series, and his character twist at the end of the game is ridiculously awesome. It's legit one of the coolest parts of the entire series, and probably the most underrated bit of greatness in the series, to be honest. Most folks write off this game's story because the gameplay is incredibly controversial, and the three leads are admittedly underdeveloped, but they do have believable motivations, and basically everything else in the narrative is spot on. While the highs of 6 are much higher than the highs of 2, the story in 2 is much more consistent and engaging without as many stumbles, so that's why it edges out 6 on my list. Number 5. Final Fantasy IV. Okay, now we're into my absolute favorites of the series in terms of story. The best of the best. It's so incredibly hard to rank these last few because I love them so much, and honestly my opinion can change based on the day of the week, so the order of these last few is much more fluid. At the time of this writing, I decided to place Final Fantasy IV in the number 5 spot on this ranking, though on a different day it could elevate to number 2 easily. Final Fantasy IV tells the story of the Dark Knight Cecil, captain of an airship battalion known as the Red Wings. After committing treacherous war crimes under the orders of his king, Cecil begins to question the morality of his actions and undergoes a quest for redemption, and ultimately saves the world in the process of uncovering the secrets behind his world's elemental crystals. The crystal motif of Final Fantasy I and III, and later entries like V, is mixed together with the evil Empire motifs of II to create the core story of IV, combining the best of what the previous games had to offer. While II had great guest characters and a weaker main cast, IV's cast is stacked full of greatness. Cecil is a top-tier Final Fantasy character and arguably the best lead in the series, but every supporting party member is full of personality, charm, and interesting character moments alongside a plot full of momentum and great set pieces. Many consider Final Fantasy IV to be the first video game with a truly great narrative. While most prefer the story of 6 to 4, I vastly prefer 4 to 6, and its story is easily my favorite of the Super Nintendo era Final Fantasies. That's not to say I'm blind to the story's flaws. The escalation of the narrative at the end can seem to come out of nowhere in the initial translation of the game, though more recent versions have helped significantly with foreshadowing. There are also a number of fake-out scenes, which anybody who's played 4 knows what I'm talking about, and later scenes end up undermining those dramatic moments. The quality of those fake-out scenes vary, but the emotional gut punch in each moment is palpable. Beyond that, not all of the fake-out scenes are fake-outs, and that has led to some of the most emotionally powerful and tragic moments in the entire series. So while yes, There are some obvious narrative flaws. The story does so much right that it doesn't stop the game from ranking in the top 5, but it does stop the game from ranking any higher. Still, Final Fantasy IV is an amazing video game story and an absolutely incredible narrative of redemption that speaks to the very core of my soul. I love Final Fantasy IV's story, and it's one of my absolute favorites in the series. Number 4. Final Fantasy IX. Final Fantasy IX kept going back and forth with the Netscam on this ranking as I was making this list, so if you don't like the placement, neither do I, and you can headcanon switch them. As of the day I'm writing this, I'm placing Final Fantasy IX in the number 4 spot on my ranking of Final Fantasy stories. The story of Final Fantasy IX begins when a band of thieves is hired to kidnap the Princess of Alexandria, Garnet. Zidane, one of the members of the thief troupe, succeeds in kidnapping the princess, but not everything goes according to plan. It turns out that the princess actually wanted to be kidnapped, and in the chaos, Zidane accidentally drags along a young black mage named Vivi and an overzealous Alexandrian knight named Steiner, who wants nothing more than to return the princess home and have Zidane arrested. However, when their airship crash lands in the evil forest, the group must work together to survive. We eventually learn the reason why Garnet wanted to be kidnapped, why Zidane was hired for the job, and what kind of evil force threatens the world. There's a lot going on in the story of Final Fantasy IX. There's plenty of action, comedy, romance, whimsy, fun, and adventure, but also plenty of dark moments and more mature themes like death and self-identity. The story has a great balance between charming humor, adventurous swashbuckling, intense drama, and profound philosophizing. The narrative is balanced well, with different character motivations moving the story forward, with external pressures also appropriately pushing them in interesting directions. Like 13, 9 has a strong character web in terms of party dynamics, and this leads to excellent storytelling. Beyond that, the characters, including the side characters, are full of personality and a constant joy to watch on screen. Final Fantasy IX's story will make you laugh, make you cry, and keep you on the edge of your seat with excitement. It's exactly what you want from a great story. That said, there are a few minor problems with the narrative, and when I say minor, I really mean minor, and this is nitpicking. Like 4, the final arc of the story can seem to come out of nowhere, especially the final boss, and I don't think the foreshadowing for this game is quite as good as 4's. There are also some parts of the story in later sections of the game that feel a bit rushed. Don't get me wrong, the game hides this better than Xenogears and Final Fantasy VIII, but it's still something that an astute player can notice. It doesn't hurt the overall experience by much at all, but it's clear that certain characters introduced towards the end were supposed to have a much larger role in the story, and got a lot of their development cut due to time constraints, and that's all I'll say without spoiling anything. Final Fantasy IX is full of some of the most memorable moments in the series, and the game is successful at basically every emotional beat it wants to hit. 9 has some of the highest highs in the series in terms of narrative, and is easily in discussion for the greatest narrative in all of video games, let alone Final Fantasy. It's a masterpiece, and I truly love it. Number 3. Final Fantasy Tactics. The story of Final Fantasy Tactics revolves around Ramza Beolv, a character in-world historians remember as an insignificant footnote during an era of intense bloodshed and political instability known as the War of the Lions, where 2 opposing factions sought to claim rule over the realm of Ivalice. Historians remember a commoner named Delita Hyrule bringing the war to an end and bringing peace to Ivalice after ascending the throne himself. But a historian uncovered the truth of the era and the much larger role that Ramza played in the conflict. Final Fantasy Tactics is a tightly woven political narrative that takes place in the same universe as Final Fantasy XII, though this game came out years before that one did. It's the only spin-off game to have its own spin-off become a main series installment. The game was incredibly well received by fans, and one of the aspects most praised about the game is its story. Final Fantasy Tactics is quite similar to Game of Thrones in a number of ways, and it makes sense given that both are based off the same historical conflict, England's infamous War of the Roses. Final Fantasy Tactics is very much a Yasume Matsuno story, so politics, gray morality, betrayal, and complex competing factions are very much at the forefront of the narrative, alongside a healthy dose of religious skepticism. There are a myriad of mature themes in the game, like the brutality of the economic class struggle, the trauma of sexual abuse, and the merits of consequentialism versus a more subjective morality are all things that the game tackles head-on with its story, and it actually addresses all of this more mature subject matter extremely well. Mature themes do not automatically make for a good story, but they don't automatically make for a bad story either. In the case of Final Fantasy Tactics, Matsuno had a story he wanted to tell, and he told it brilliantly. While Tactics does have some lighter moments, those are clearly not the focus of the narrative. That said, It doesn't feel like the game is too consumed by darkness either. The story ultimately manages to find a balance and is told in incredibly intricate detail, perfectly executing its desired goals. The only real weakness the story has is in its main cast. Aside from Ramza, most of the permanent party members don't get enough screen time in the labyrinthian narrative to make you feel invested in their personal journeys. I think I actually enjoy the stories of 4 and 9 better than Tactics, but I think Tactics is actually better written, hence it getting the number 3 spot on my list. Number 2, Final Fantasy X. Final Fantasy X tells the story of Tidus, a star blitzball player, aka underwater soccer, from the technologically advanced city of Zanarkand. He gets flung 1,000 years into the future and meets a young summoner named Yuna. In the world of Spira, where the game takes place, the inhabitants are tortured by a giant reincarnating kaiju monster known as Sin that destroys villages and countless lives. Summoners make a pilgrimage to the ruins of Zanarkand in order to obtain the power to defeat Sin, and Tidus finds himself joining Yuna on her journey to defeat Sin and hopefully find a way to end the cycle of violence once and for all. Like Tactics, X's story has a lot of emphasis on the corrupting influence of institutions and organized religion, and even tackles ideas like bigotry and cultural suppression, but the story is ultimately far less political in nature. 10 instead focuses most of its attention on its strong, nuanced cast, and is more of a traditional Final Fantasy game in terms of story structure. However, this game was made after years of refining the Final Fantasy formula, and it's absolutely a home run. The story flows at a perfect pace between more action-oriented moments, drama, comedy, and pure fun. In addition, the game has arguably the strongest romantic subplot in the entire series. Final Fantasy X has one of the most intricately and perfectly designed JRPG stories in the history of the genre. The structure is incredibly tight in terms of world building, character arcs, lore, and flow of plot beats. Basically everything in the game has a purpose and ties together into the story that Final Fantasy X is trying to tell. There's a lot of elements in there, and all of them end up working really well. The fact that all of these elements are able to be tied together so brilliantly is a testament to the careful planning and masterful storycraft of the devs. Final Fantasy X is truly one of the JRPG greats, and its story earns the number 2 spot on this list. Number 1, Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy VII has the most iconic story in the Final Fantasy series, and in my opinion, it's also the best. The story follows Cloud Strife, a mercenary who used to be an elite soldier working for the Shinra Electric Power Company, a fascist corporation that essentially has dominance over the entire planet. Shinra has been extracting Mako energy from the planet to serve as a power source, but this Mako energy is the lifeblood of the planet, and the greed of the company is leading to the death of said planet. Cloud gets hired by an eco-terrorist group named Avalanche to fight against Shinra, but a mysterious enemy from Cloud's past suddenly appears, and the battle for the future of the planet escalates to an intergalactic scale. Final Fantasy VII takes the Save the World from Darkness theme of the previous games and makes it much more visceral and real with a threat that resonates with modern audiences: ruthless capitalism. Final Fantasy VII does not shy away from its pro-environmental, anti-corporate politics, but the game has so much more to it than just that. A big theme of the game is life and death, and how the two intertwine. In addition to that, another major theme is confronting the truth of one's past, and unification of the psyche to heal past traumas. The story has a bittersweet romance, aka the best kind of romance in fiction, humor, tragedy, despair, and hope. If I had to ascribe a general concept for each of the main cast, it's finding a way to overcome trauma and move towards a better tomorrow. Every party member is great and has layers of nuance and depth. There's not a weak link to be found. The main villain, Sephiroth, is the perfect antagonist for this story, and his build-up in the original game, akin to the shark from Jaws, is brilliant, as is the utilization of gameplay mechanics to showcase his strength. It's an excellent use of the medium to enhance the story. Shinra itself could have easily served as the primary antagonist of the game, but the fact that Sephiroth is part of unintentional blowback of Shinra's greed just further enhances the narrative themes of the story, while also allowing a far more personal demon for Cloud to confront. Jenova serves the game well as a primal, instinctual threat, so the trinity of villains allows for the personal, psychological, primal, and planetary adversaries all in the same story, complementing each other and the themes brilliantly. It's truly masterful. This is the game that has the "Luke, I am your father" moment of video games. It has the most heartbreaking scene in the history of the series. It has the greatest love triangle in JRPG history. It has arguably the best main character arc in JRPG history, and the rest of the character arcs are pretty damn good as well. Final Fantasy VII is the king of the mountain when it comes to stories in the Final Fantasy series. Because it gets a lot of attention, it also attracts a lot of hate, and there are those who argue that the story itself isn't very good. Simply put, those people are wrong. Final Fantasy VII is a masterpiece of the JRPG genre. Yes, the initial translation of the game could have been better, but a few typos and awkward prose here or there doesn't diminish the mastercraft of the storytelling on display here. Is it as deep as Xenogears? Not quite, but it's still easily the most profound game in the Final Fantasy series. Final Fantasy VII is my favorite Final Fantasy story, and I truly believe it to be the best example of great storytelling in the series. It's the most popular one for a reason, and one of the biggest reasons for its popularity is its amazing story. And that amazing story ranks number 1 on this list. Thanks for watching this video. Again, these lists are my personal opinion, and I'm definitely curious to see you guys posting your rankings in the comments below. Be sure to do the YouTube things, the liking, the subscribing, etc. You know what to do. And if you like this video, don't forget to check out the other rankings in the series. Thanks for watching, and I hope you find peace and happiness in your life. Cheers!